Okay, well, croeso, prynhawn da, to this event on nature finance and the wellbeing economy. I'm Jane Powell. I'm wearing two hats today. One is Cyfan Cymru, which is the organisation that sits behind the Wales Real Food and Farming Conference, and the other is the Dyfi Biosphere, just behind me. This is the UNESCO designation for an area of mid Wales around Aberystwyth and Machynlleth. And one of the things that the function of the biosphere is to explore ways in which the human economy can work alongside the natural environment so that the two go together, which is a concept that's known as the well-being economy. And an important part of that is nature finance, which is the topic of today. So we called this meeting because actually I need to know about nature finance. The Dyfi Biosphere needs to know about it. And also what we want to do with that is to share our learning. So the idea is the biosphere goes on a learning journey, and then we share that around with our partners around Wales, so that we're a beacon for Wales's learning. So I'm really thrilled that we've got some really good speakers this afternoon, with all at different stages of the nature finance process. So we're going to hear from those in a minute. I want to encourage those of you in the chat, those of you in the audience, to introduce yourselves in the chat. Just say who you are and where you're from. And I'm just going to launch a poll, which to find out what sort of knowledge we have in the room. So you should be able to see that now. So we just fill in, let us know how much you already know about nature finance, so that we can get a sense of what the level is. Right, hang on. So I think we'll stop there. That's enough. I think that gives us quite a good idea. I think, and this should be sharing the results. I don't know if that works or not. But anyway, 72%, 78% of people said they knew a bit. 22% said they didn't know what it was, and nobody said that they knew a lot. Although I think a couple of our speakers do actually know quite a lot, but maybe they weren't filling it in. Right, we'll have some speakers, and there'll be time to ask questions at the end. So now I'm delighted to introduce our chair, Liz Lewis-Reddy, Dr. Liz Lewis-Reddy, who is the principal scientist of the land use team at FERA, which is Food and Environment Research Agency, which came out of DEFRA. And she specialises in the ecological and economic viability of sustainable land management, and has extensive experience of UK agriculture and policy. And she and her husband have an organic beef and sheep farm just outside Llandrindod Wells. So she's got credentials. She knows what she's talking about here. And the role of farming in the economy and in society. So I'm delighted to hand over to Liz now to lead the session.
Thank you very much, Jane.
That's lovely.
Excellent. Well, as Jane mentioned, we've got some really interesting and useful speakers on this topic this afternoon. And the plan is I'll introduce who they are and their titles briefly, and then they'll give a bit more detail about what exactly they're going to talk to you about in their individual presentation slots. We're going to start off with Kath Howell, who is the Head of Natural Capital Developments at Bawn Breachrainiog National Park Authority. And she is responsible for piloting and scaling nature finance opportunities at a landscape scale within the park. We also have Alice Briggs, who's Programme Manager for Tir Connell, has a background in museum curation and is a socially engaged artist, and she's going to talk about the learning journey that she's been on with the work she's been doing. And then we have Chris Harris, who's the Programme Manager for the Living Levels Landscape Partnership on the Gwent Levels in South Wales, and he himself is going to share his journey as well. And that is the principle of a lot of our presentations today, is understanding the journey of understanding and exploration in this space. So it would be a really useful session to get your insights on and get your thoughts on what you've heard today. Please do pop them in the chat, as Jane has mentioned. If anybody, will save them for the end, but if anyone wants to put their question either in Welsh at the end or in the chat, then Jane will translate it for the discussion session towards the end. I will also be gathering some questions as you go, so I'll kick us off if we're all a bit shy at the end. But at this point, I'll hand over to Kath to tell us about her perspectives on the well-being economy and financing nature recovery. Over to you, Kath.
Wonderful. Thank you to Jane again for putting this wonderful discussion together, and to Liz to chair this discussion. And as mentioned, my core purpose, I've been in post for about 10 months now, is to really pilot things. It kind of means, getting out there in terms of like practical examples of how we can catalyze new forms of funding for nature's recovery in Wales. And I thought that the title of this work, Wellbeing Economy and Nature Finance, was in and of itself helpful to sort of kick us off. And I'm just going to set my timer because those on the call know I can talk for a while. So thank you all for sparing time to come to this discussion. And as Liz said, I think it's really helpful to get your feedback as well. As we are learning, we are on this journey. I'd put myself in the bit to moving up to a lot essentially, but it's an emerging market, and I think we're all kind of in this learning journey together. So there's 3 parts to this presentation. I'm going to kind of do a little bit of setting the scene around conceptually what the wellbeing economy is, what nature finance is, and then really think about what the sort of practical aspects of that are within the national park as we've sort of envisaged this in the 10 months I've been in post. So just to sort of kick us off again with like, when we think about like a well-being economy, it's one that's designed much more to serve people and planet and not really the other way around. And it sort of, puts forward then a definition that puts our human and planetary needs at the center of its activities. And, within the brilliant legislation in Wales, the Wellbeing of Futures Generation Act, I think it calls us all to think about what this definition means in practice. One of the big challenges with the Act is moving from that big policy to practice. And this table, I'm not going to go through it all, I think be thankful to hear, but sort of sometimes helpful within this frame to think about what our current frame of economic thinking, our dominant frame of thinking is capitalism and neoliberal consensus versus a well-being economy. And again, not going to go through every piece of this, but a well-being economy would move us in a direction where instead of a kind of one-off metric that you would have heard in the news today, GDP, we're thinking much wider about what good looks like in terms of our social foundations and planetary boundaries. There's lots of sort of work here in terms of then justice and equity and community wealth building. Like, what does it mean to have an economy that serves the many and not the few? And, as part of that, I think, the talk today, what's really interesting is that we're all coming with sort of place-based work. And I think that aspect of this is incredibly important, as is then, this piece here where we think about a much more inclusive and participatory approach to designing solutions, as opposed to sort of letting the sort of neoliberal markets as efficient allocators of resources, state steps out of the way. So, I don't like to put things into kind of polarized discussions, but I do think this sort of helps in terms of like framing of what we mean by a kind of well-being economy and how it kind of feeds into our journey, because we're all sort of discovering and unfolding the future around how nature finance can work for Wales. What this does practically mean in our kind of world of work then is that you should be able to see much more purpose-driven goals, governance systems that support citizens, assembly, participatory budgeting, for example, but are much fairer and responsive, and processes that kind of support the complexity of what we're dealing in. And as I've mentioned before, I think the key here in the nature finance piece is this like understanding of contracts that can be worked through where resources are kind of regenerative and not extractive. So happy to talk about examples of that further on. At BANI, so that's the sort of kind of the well-being economy piece. I want to talk about like conceptually then the sort of nature finance world. We've developed a working definition that nature finance can encapsulate basically any money, right? Any funding, so that's grants or finance, that's money that will require its, return, like loans, debt and equity. But within those funding structures, there is a definite need for that to be focused on then being regenerative for both nature and communities. And this definition, I don't think it's one that you'll find used everywhere. Nature finance tends to be used quite narrowly in the form of like private sector finance. And I want to bring us back to like why we're even talking about nature finance. And you'll hear in this field a huge and overwhelming sense of like the nature finance gap. And these numbers need ground truthing, but they are globally in the trillions. In Wales, they're in the billions. This gap, what it means is that if we're going to recover nature to a sufficient level, achieve the 30 by 30 biodiversity goals, then the funding beyond the public funding currently available is in the billions. And I think, you know, we have to kind of work as as practitioners in this space to really understand what that number means for our farming communities, for our communities around Banai. You'll often also hear that if we don't do anything about the nature crisis, and I'm sure many of you are already very aware of the potential unfolding issues with relation to climate and nature related risks. In Banai this summer, we've had several droughts and wildfires. These obviously result in further loss of nature, further loss of livelihoods, you know, farm prices, input prices going up. And so, you know, this urgent need to address the nature recovery challenge is sort of given to us then as saying, well, what's the funding that's available to support transition towards more nature-friendly farming practices, for example, and a restoration future. So that's the sort of like context setting of why we even talk about nature finance as a field. It's very emergent, and what you'll see is that there's quite an uneven policy environment between England and Wales. So you have legislation in England around biodiversity net gain, for example. I'm not going to talk about the technicalities of that today, and nutrient trading. So there's been like kind of, I guess, in some ways advancements in England, but not yet brought into planning legislation in Wales. I think Wales is taking its time to figure out how this should look for Wales. So what you will see in this discourse then around nature finance is this discussion around like natural capital, hence my job description, head of natural capital. So these are some of the concepts that you'll hear. Again, I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. It's sort of new words for old coin in terms of natural capital being the stock of our natural assets. So these are forests, wetlands, our fisheries. Ecosystem services are things that flow from that stock. So, you know, some things in our economy like timber production, water abstraction, food. Some things are not, like recreation, clean air, biodiversity, etc. And then a payment for that ecosystem services is exactly where some of this field of nature finance has seen an early emergence, where there's a willingness to pay landowners to restore natural habitats, potentially increase soil health, for example, and keep those payments to stewards of existing land. And what we see in this is a very contested space. So I've been in this world for like 10 months and there are lots of debates. It's a concept that's sometimes regarded with a lot of suspicion. On the other hand, if we don't value nature, which is what we've seen over the last few decades, then we are not considering it in our decision-making frameworks. And, you know, we're lacking the kind of means, therefore, to try and bring forward funding for protection and restoration. So these debates will go on. My job is not to necessarily settle them. My job is to make recommendations to open up opportunities for our farmers, our landowners around Banai, and think about what the opportunities might be. And I think we were talking before this call started that the finance piece is the economic side. The change happens in the sort of socio-cultural, the work with our communities. So we're very much at the center of that. I just want to kind of unpack that definition a little bit more that I talked about earlier, which is that nature finance kind of follows this big ladder. So if you start at the bottom here, we think about like there's a world of grants that environmental NGOs and others are already using for nature's recovery. And there's definitely more at BANAI in particular that we will be doing around this philanthropy piece. And what you see then above this philanthropy piece is an increasing kind of field of work around how you engage with the business sector and public sector, because floods are impacting businesses and our public services. So, to what extent is, for example, Network Rail, Do Cymru, Welsh Water, Transport for Wales, for example, willing to invest now in nature's solutions to, say, increase soil health, to keep water in the soil, so that they increase their operational resilience. It's sort of like a prevention payment. And then above that, you get these sort of insetting partnerships where, for example, like Marks and Spencer's have livestock producers in their supply chain in and across Wales. Marks and Spencer's, much like a lot of other corporates, are doing their carbon accounting and seeing that they want to support, on one hand, like the farmers to help reduce their carbon input on farms. So there's sort of these partnerships forming where corporates are willing to support that transition on farm as well. And in some cases then buying offsets to offset the remaining impact of their business that they can't kind of design out. And the final piece of this then, we talk about investments an awful lot, but the investments piece is actually something that would involve like a debt or equity or a blend of finance between, debt plus some grants, for example. And that sort of recoverable funding therefore needs cash flow, and happy to give further examples on that. But it's just to say then the nature finance toolbox is rather broad, and there's a whole variety of reasons why. In particular, our focus has been on why the private sector would get involved in this, and I've sort of already mentioned a few. So I'll leave this slide with you, and here are some of the companies that we've been sort of either talking to or following. There's some of work, there's an enormous list of actors in this area of work, and there's enormous lists of different reasons. And I think for me, we need to open up a piece of work and understand better when we talk about the private sector investing in nature. It is a diverse picture, lots of greenwashing, but lots of companies genuinely trying to do good. And how do we kind of work with those kind of, I guess, ethically aligned as well, partners in this field. So the last piece of this sort of presentation, and sorry, I'm going very quickly here, is just to give you a little sense of like what BANAI is doing at the moment. Like, how do we design nature finance so that it serves the people and the planet in line with that well-being economy definition? And I'm just feel so privileged to like work in an organization which has already set down, if you look at the future BANAI, Dyfodol BANAI, it's the management plan that was formed with a variety of partners around the park. They set down like these huge missions around climate, water, nature. It used what's called the donor economics to kind of mark out where we are. And if you look at this, one kind of piece of the donut, the biodiversity loss in the park is worse inside the park than outside the boundaries. And we're not doing particularly well on our transition towards a net zero future either. At the same time, we see communities also challenged by cost of living, housing, etc. And so having this policy context is like the major starting point for some of our work and the guiding principles that come from that. It's a bit of a repeat of what I've said earlier, but this is how we work. We kind of lean on these design principles to say everything we should be doing here is done with, not for or to people. It's coordinated. We're looking for, working in systems and not one-off changes. And really sort of at the heart of that is this big goal of sort of, driving the scale of funding into this area. We have therefore set down a strategic body of work around these 5 different pillars. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to say we have some pilots. We're working on building our fundraising capabilities as well as our organizational capabilities, which, this is a new field. I think anybody getting into it, just to say, my alarm's going off, so I'm going to wrap up in a minute. It's just to say that, like, as an organization, this presents us with challenges, and we want to support our farming communities to understand some of this space. So we as an organization need to invest in our capabilities too, as well as things like today, connecting with the community, learning from people, hearing what is needed in this space. So in the 10 months I've been in post, we've sort of managed to develop a small but growing innovation portfolio. One of the ways of kind of trying to work on this is to say, let's build a set of experiments. And so this shows you some of the things that we are working on already. Be very happy to come back and talk about those in more detail if there's interest as and when they develop. And I'm going to skip some of this, but I'll send the slides to you. But this example I wanted to give of like a practical example of like, how do we think about like a just transition? I think we have to think about like who owns the money, who's working with like our landowners, what say do they have, and who gains and loses in some of these transactions. So that's sort of a practical example I like to use to just sort of tease out a discussion on this, which we won't have time for today. There's lots emerging, both nationally to put the right standards around these markets, and Scotland are doing some super cool things around land reform. Contentious again, but interesting for us to think about in a wellbeing economy in Wales, including community right to buy. I'd just say that, you know, as much as this sometimes feels really new, it's not. Like, this is already happening. It's just happening. We're not calling it like finance for nature recovery. There's just a ton of stuff that's already happening around the system. And part of my job is to find the spaces that it's not already happening and work from there. I'll send these slides on. There's some resources here. There's also a Welsh forum for nature finance in Wales. So please do follow that link, join the forum. There's lots of spaces to come and learn more here. And just want to say thank you again. Here's my details. It's an open invite to come and talk to us. We are on this journey. We love to hear from people because it helps us shape what we need to do. So that's probably the quickest I could ever talk about those two big topics. And I've gone over time. So I do apologize, Liz, and everybody else. I will stop there.
Excellent. Thank you, Kath. And don't worry, you had a couple minutes to spare because I finished a bit earlier, so we're still on track, which is perfect. And as I said, we'll gather questions together at the end. So we'll move swiftly on to Alice, who's going to talk to us about learnings from Summit to Sea. Over to you, Alice.
Helps if I unmute myself. Yes, there we are. Can everyone see that? I'll just slide from the beginning, because that was the end. Okay. Right, so I just thought I'd give an overview of Tir Canol and our programme for those who don't know anything about it very, very quickly. So we're a community that's designing and providing positive outcomes for nature and people through our use of the land and sea. This is where we're based. So we work with Jane and the Biosphere as one of our partners. Tir Canol is essentially a partnership, and it starts at the Dyfi at the top, down to the Treidol, geographically, it's our sort of southern area, and out across the Cambrian Mountains and northern Cambrian Mountains as well. I've put this in because we were talking about base context, and I'm aware that I introduced myself in the bio as a museum curator and an artist, which made me feel like a bit of an imposter actually within the kind of ecological conservation field. But this is my home. I was brought up on Mynydd Bach, just south of the Tir Canol area. But this is my geography. And I've worked as an artist and lived in this space for my whole life. And farming, I was brought up on a sheep farm, and I guess that's always been a big interest for me, and something that I've worked on within the museum sector and the history of the area and the agricultural kind of environment, particularly, and artists who are a big part of our way of working at Tir Canol. just to give a bit of context. So how did we come about? So 2000, here's a bit of a timeline. The project began o'r Mynydd i'r Môr, Summit to Sea, in September 2018. Rewilding Britain as project leads. There were other projects partners were RSPB, Wildlife Trust, WWF, Ecodyfi, Mont Wildlife, the Penllyn ar Sanau Sat, Cambrian Wildwood as it was then, and Cambrian Mountain Society, etc. There were quite a few partners. The way that the project was introduced to the community was very top down, and this is one of our biggest pieces of learning, because it did not go down well with the local community. There had been no discussion and consultation with the community before bringing this project in. So it was very much sort of, we believe that you need this attitude. So there was a huge breakdown in trust with the community very, very quickly, and one of the biggest problems was Rewilding Britain, partly the way they approached things, but also and the kind of perception, and it was very, and again we use the word, it was very contentious. There was a lot of kind of national publicity around this with National Farmers Union, Farmers Wales, and George Monbiot going at it in The Guardian particularly. And so there was a big breakdown in trust between the farming community, but the local community, and then the partners themselves, which forced several partners to leave. And ultimately then, in order to move things forward, Rewilding Britain left the entire project and the partnership. What I've realised, I've only been in post for 10 months, and what I've realised since coming in is that many people felt, what I'm getting the impression anyway, is that a lot of people felt that Summit to Sea then ended as a project. It didn't. What happened was that then there was a review of and reflection of what had happened through the rest of the partnership. And that meant that 2 years then went into co-production, full working with the community to look at what had happened, why it had gone wrong, and what we could learn from that experience. So what did we hope to achieve? Co-designing with people in the area, a vision where nature and people thrive from the summit to the sea, essentially. I won't go into all of that detail because I could do a whole hour at least on that, but hundreds of people were consulted. There was a fantastic liaison group. There were many organisations. Farmers were brought in on board, and there was a real, over that 2-year process, a real turning around of the trust in what was happening, and ultimately it led to the whole project turning down over £3 million worth of funding from the Endangered Landscape Scheme, because it was not felt that it was right for this area what was being proposed. So I think that's a really clear example there, where in a place-based context you sometimes need to turn down the money in order to make it work culturally for a place, and to build trust as well in a nature recovery project. So what came out of that of that period of time was a blueprint with a series of themes, and I was quite interested to see there's a lot of crossover in the Banau Brycheiniog themes, I think, potentially. There's land and sea, human connections, research, development and learning together, and narrative and policy. And the whole approach is absolutely led and lives and breathes through co-production with the community. And the blueprint that came out of that is now what I am kind of leading a programme of work for, and we are funded now by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation for a 4-year period. So we're two years into that 4-year period of time at the moment. So just to bring us up to speed on the timeline, there's the co-development phase. RSPB became the host, so I'm currently employed by RSPB as the main host of the partnership, and does the vision. And now we are delivering that vision for this current period of time up to 2027. And we have a nature officer, a community, an engagement officer, and a sort of a small team really helping us to helping me to deliver that from the programme perspective, and a series of projects including flood management scheme with a local with a village to the north, Dalabont, and crop trials that have been subcontracted to Land Workers Alliance, so they're working with us. So multiple partners, I won't go into them all. And a really key one as well that I wanted to talk about from my own experience, which is a Nature Networks funded project called Changing Tides, which has brought me into the world of blue carbon and blue carbon finance. But I'll talk about that more in a minute. So just to kind of finish on our vision, that that period of time brought us to this vision, which is very much, and we'll notice there is no use of the word rewilding in anything that we do now. And again, it's become a very contentious word in Mid Wales. I think beautifully that kind of articulated the problematic kind of aspects of using the word rewilding in Carwyn Graves's book Tir and the landscape history of the landscape in Wales. So recommend that to anyone if they haven't read it, because yeah, it just perfectly articulates some of the reasons why, well, yeah, the main reasons why we don't use that word. And then just before I move on to a little bit of talking about blue carbon, but one of the key things then that the partnership looked at was, of course, then, well, what are the funding sources that we're happy to move forward with? And this is a very iterative process, and in terms of a kind of a decision making for the partnership, and it's not been ratified in any way just yet. But I think what I noticed as soon as I came in was the box in the corner that said Tir Canol will not seek funding from the following sources: carbon offsetting, carbon financing being different, greenwashing, and then if the funding sources funded other projects which could undermine Tir Canol. But that is quite a minefield, and it requires, you know, what I'd like to do, a piece of work I'd like to do now is, well, what do we mean by that? Because 3 lines on a bit of a, you know, on a slide is not really going to help us to determine those answers. And obviously they're all conversations that are had within the partnership. And we're not currently a charity or a company where we sit as a programme within RSPB. But the next steps for me going forward are, well, what does that mean? And how, and if we're going to have a really robust policy, does it need to sit from an ethical perspective? Does it need to sit through a kind of fundraising strategy? How do we determine what that means, and how do we do the research that gives us that information? Like, how is it going to undermine us? How is it greenwashing? How far along the chain of funding do you go back to the source in order to determine whether it is going to be okay for us? I mean, because you can create problems in most funding sources, probably, if you want to take the trail back far enough. So we need to have all of these discussions, and it is really complex. But I suppose the key thing is that the way that we work now is all of those decisions are done with our communities, so that it's very transparent and we're managing expectations. So we wouldn't take on a huge project, we wouldn't go to funders without checking with our liaison groups and our community and our co-production groups first. So that lesson has been learned. I won't finish. I mean, I'll finish the slides and stop sharing maybe just there. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the blue carbon work that I've been kind of learning about in recent months, and I've got some links that I can share with you in the chat in a minute, because the one of the key projects that I'm working on, as I said, is Project Changing Tides, which is a coastal adaptation piece to produce a co-produced handbook for the residents of the Dyfi to help really to give them agency around coastal adaptation. So what does the future of the Dyfi estuary look like, and to provide resources and information on policy, terminology, what is coastal adaptation, what is holding the line, what is climate change in this context, what are the future scenarios for the Dyfi. But we're also looking at blue carbon. And when I read that coming into post, what is blue carbon? And we've ended up having to do quite a lot of research on blue carbon as opposed to green carbon, which is essentially around calculating the carbon that is locked into the sea and into the coastal area and the salt marshes, as opposed to the woodlands and peatlands when we talk about the green carbon scenario. But again, it's really unregulated at the moment, and there's a huge amount of work going on. And anyway, everybody I've spoken to over the last few months will also say, but we're not an expert, and it's changing really fast. So nobody wants to kind of say, unless there have been there are a couple of companies like the Earth Finance Company, I've got them right, and then FTech I spoke to, but these are kind of private finance companies, and they have economists who are leading them. And what became really apparent as well was that a lot of those finance models potentially could involve buying and purchasing of land in order to then give those companies another kind of blue. You could go into this stage of like, is it blue washing? But we don't know, because there's no regulation and we don't know what that means. So for Tir Cannol, again, our area, very, very tricky kind of scenario to be looking at modelling, where the trust has only just been rebuilt, or is still being rebuilt with our communities. I don't really want to go back to them and say, well, actually, one way of saving the coast, so we could sell up parts of it and give it to corporate companies, and they'll be in control, and then they can offset their carbon. I mean, these are very, I'm being deliberately provocative, but these are the leaps that the community make very, very quickly, especially when you're recovering from a situation where they've already felt that trust is broken. So at the moment, there's a lot of my work is just trying to inform ourselves as for Tir Cannol and the partnership, so to inform our partners and the organisation so we can build up our own knowledge, but very much as well then that we're able to pass on that knowledge and that in a really accessible way to landowners, to whether they be private, whether they're farmers or whether they're organisations here, or whether it's because we want to work with the university and Network Rail because we want to save the railway for the future, and we all need to get together to do that. Because as soon as we start looking into one thing, you realise that the systems are all, it is all about these systems being connected, and we're not just dealing with coastal sea level rise, we're dealing with the entire well-being economy, of an economy of the whole geographic area. So
Alice?
Yeah.
Can I draw you a close there? Yes, that's on a very strong point that we're looking at the interconnected systems that exist within these interconnected systems. But thank you, Alice. That was excellent. You mentioned you were going to pop some links in the chat. Excellent. All right. Well, I'm sure we can explore this further with Alice in the question and answer section. But at this moment, I'd like to turn over to Chris, who'll be specifically talking to us about nature finance in the Gwent levels. Really like the cross section of Wales we're doing today in an hour. Thank you very much. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Liz. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Lovely, thank you. I'll just give you a very quick sort of introduction to Living Levels. We are a landscape partnership. We've been together now for over 10 years. We are based on the Gwent Levels down in South Wales. And arguably, this is one of the most threatened landscapes in Wales. We're on a major transport route. We are surrounded by growing urban centres. We have lots of industrial development. Latterly, we've had incredible interest from solar farm companies wanting to site on this land as well. The whole area covers around about 200 square kilometres, and if you sort of want to try and imagine it, we're a very, very flat coastal plain bordering onto the Severn Estuary. And I'll bring you up a little map in a moment. The partnership is hosted by RSPB Cymru, includes Natural Resources Wales, the 3 local authorities that cover the area, Cardiff, Newport and Monmouthshire, Gwent Wildlife Trust, and latterly we've been joined by SUBREC, South East Wales Biological Biodiversity Record Centre, and Cadw as well now. And although the project isn't, or the programme isn't primarily about nature restoration, that is at the heart of what we do, but we also are very interested in heritage, this sense of place, and obviously sort of connecting with all the communities that live on and around the Gwent Levels. We have around about 650,000 people living immediately around the levels or on the levels, and you could probably add another 1 million people within a very short sort of journey from here. So for all of those people, this is the landscape that they know, that they can see from their windows, that they travel through on the way to work or the way to school. So it's an incredibly important landscape to be working in terms of connecting with all those people. In addition to that, of course, it's also an incredibly important area for its biodiversity as well. We have 8 SSSIs that cover around about 80 square kilometres of the levels. And I'll just bring a little map to show you the area we're talking about here. And we have this amazing drainage system that extends to around about 1,500 kilometres. So every single field on the levels is bordered by drainage ditches that feed into reens, and then eventually, obviously, down to the estuary and drain into the estuary. The whole landscape sits at or below sea level. So it's a very precarious landscape in many respects. Obviously, with climate change, with rising sea levels, the whole landscape is protected by a seawall. But you only have to stand on that seawall now on a high spring tide, on a stormy day, and the water is literally lapping over the top of the seawall now. So it's a very precarious landscape. It's predominantly a pastoral landscape. It's farmed by around about 125 different farms. But again, with these huge sort of urban areas all the way around it, we've got Chepstow in the east, and then the city of Newport in the middle there, and then down to the suburbs of Cardiff. So it's a very challenging area to work in. But as I said, we've been working here for the last, over 10 years now. We originally got our grant funding from Lottery back in 2018 for the delivery of the first phase of Living Levels, which went incredibly well. We had fantastic buy-in from the local community, and also really good engagement with farmers as well. And when that project eventually came to an end, we had COVID in the middle of it. So our funders, principal funders, Lottery, extended our funding for another year. And we managed to sort of eke it out for 5 years in the end. And we've now successfully had a second development grant to prepare another bid for a 5-year follow-on project, which all being well will be starting next year and will run through till 2031. So I just wanted to give a few sort of reflections on the way that our funding has worked. And I've spent pretty much the last sort of 25 years working on a variety of different lottery funded projects. And I mean, it must be said off the bat that without Heritage Lottery funding, the state of UK conservation would be infinitely worse than it is now. And as I'm sure most of you on this call will probably know, UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. We have a biodiversity intact index of around about 53%, which puts us about 142nd in 201 countries. And that's on the back of, over a century of conservation activity in the UK. We have some wonderfully dedicated people, wonderful organisations working in the UK. But the trajectory has been downhill for the last century or so. And I think that's a sad indictment of UK conservation in many respects. Lots of individual successes, no doubt, but the trajectory is undeniably down. And I think part of the problem is that the way we fund these projects within the UK, I hope I don't have to spend too much time sort of lauding the benefits of working at scale across whole landscapes now. I mean, the benefits of doing that, I think, are quite obvious. But we are trapped within this ridiculous short-term funding cycle. Our original funding for the project was 3 years, which I think is very typical for these funded landscape projects in the UK. And of course, I just don't think that gives you terribly good value for money, not for the funders, and I don't think it gives you the lasting benefits for nature recovery that obviously we all want to see. And I think partly that's down to the funders, perhaps for understandable reasons. They don't want to get trapped into funding the same projects, for successive years. But I think many of our organisations that we work for are institutionally now sort of captured within that. We're conditioned to think about our projects within those sort of limited terms, and I think, particularly where we're dealing with communities, with individuals, with landowners in particular, we have to be looking at much more longer term investment and commitment to our landscapes. Many of the people that live here may have been here for generations, certainly with regard to the farmers, particularly places like the Levels. You've got generation after generation that have worked this land, and we turn up with our short-term funding, and everybody gets very excited, and we can fund things like grassland restoration or ditch management or planting new orchards. And then our money runs out and we move on to the next thing. And, these communities and these landowners are left wondering, well, what on earth was that all about? So I strongly believe that we have to be looking at much more longer term projects within these landscapes. And of course, that all comes down to funding then. As I said, I'm tremendously grateful for the lottery. If nothing else, they've kept me employed for the last 25 years or so. Kudos to them. But there is this ridiculous short-term funding cycle that many of us are now trapped in, and I've had lots of conversations with this with partner organisations, and I know that feeling is quite prevalent. So how do we break out of this? And of course, now that we're sort of thinking about our next 5-year project and how do we sort of keep that going afterwards, then this nature financing, green financing is obviously one way that we're really interested in sort of breaking into. I mean, we're really at the outset of our journey, and I'm tremendously grateful to Catherine for all that information that she's put together for the national park. But it really does feel like wandering into a minefield. I think that there are so many potential pitfalls here. It all feels incredibly unregulated and a little bit Wild West. And I think conversations like these, where we can bring together people that all different stages of that journey, are incredibly important to help us all to sort of navigate through this. You can see the potential there for locking in local businesses into the local environment, into the local landscape. So they're not just sitting within that landscape, they're actually contributing towards it. They're not taking away, they're contributing. And the same with the landowners as well, trying to find ways to make the economics of nature-friendly farming work on a sort of a landscape scale, so that everybody is moving in the same general direction, and that we can see those real benefits for nature recovery, for health and well-being for local communities as well. So I think that's pretty much all I've got to say on the subject, and I shall hand back to Liz. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you to all our speakers. This has been a really interesting exploration of the journey that we all, and nature finance itself, has been on. I've been working in this space for probably longer than I'd like to say on this call. And it is interesting how I'm about to reveal 15 years ago, we were also talking about unregulated Wild West spaces, and we are still there. Although, as Kath highlighted at the beginning, there are moves in place to introduce structures that will enable this to go from ad hoc to mainstream. But it's whether or not those structures will move fast enough and have the consensus that Alice mentioned was a challenge within the Summit to Sea region that will necessitate the change that needs to come. So I will thank the speakers again, and at this point look to see whether we've got any questions in the chat, or if anyone wants to raise their hand for a question. I've certainly got some noted down if you would prefer I kicked us off. I don't see any waving yellow hands. Please do jump forward with some questions. I know there's some coming through on the messaging system that we have amongst ourselves. So please, Jane or Jane, feel free to jump in as well. But I'll start us off with a question to Kath. Kath, it's a bit of a tour de force taking us through all of the structures and financial processes that would need to pivot in order to move from our what could be very naively described as a capitalist system to one that was much more focused with people at the center and equity, as you highlighted in one of your pillars. Just looking at Banai, do you have within those pillars you were identifying a concept of short, medium, and long term as to where the activities you can participate in now with your community, those that you see emerging on the horizon in, say, 2 to 5 years, and those that you think are a bit further afield? Can you give us a feel for an answer to that question, if that's something you've discussed?
Thanks, Liz. What a great question. And it speaks to what I would like to have done by now, which is sort of publish a bit more around our strategy. But I have been taking time to like listen and hear deeply what's going on in Wales, and like trying to kind of answer that question kind of maybe starts to reflect some of our priorities and where we're working. So our kind of, short-term kind of work is, it is going to be about building our fundraising capacity. As Chris has highlighted, there is money out there from like National Lottery, other major grants, and other, that sort of field of major grants. Like, we need to get better at doing that work as an organization to support partners and actors within Banai. And that is sort of like the short term for us, is like build that capability, because then it can allow us to do more. But it, as Chris has also highlighted, that comes with an awful lot of challenges, right? It's like 2 to 3 to 4. I think what the Landscapes Connection bit like money is like 10-year. That's still not good enough, right? Nature is going to take like decades to recover, and as like it's ultimately like farmers and communities at the heart of this change, right? Who are working, year to year on keeping their businesses profitable, right? We want to enable them and the support there to become nature stewards. We have to think in the longer term. The kind of medium sort of horizon really is to look at very established high integrity markets. So these will include things like woodland carbon codes, peatland code, and to do that at a level of nature recovery, like landscape scale, right? So we're not just going to look at like where could you plant up woodland everywhere? And then is there an offer that you could make to farmers? They can turn it down or not, right? But we, as a national park, like one of our value adds is that we've got brilliant teams of ecologists. We host the S Catchment Partnership. We've got an enormous amount of data and we engage with farmers too. We want to look at established high integrity spaces for carbon sequestration where there are established codes. So we're taking that as a kind of medium term space. The market for then kind of quote unquote selling biodiversity and on nutrients in Wales is not established. There's no compliance market around that. You do have that in England. I think it's going to come to Wales in the medium term. And I think as actors in this space, we need to understand what that means and how it is a potential betterment from the situation that we've got today. Because that's development money, right? Developers today are, being held up, for example, in the West, right? The UK government has a huge policy around house building, and houses are being held up down in Swansea because of the pollution in the river and the marine area. In all likelihood, we would see a pilot now around nutrient trading. What this practically means is that landowners could receive a payment for certain nature-based solutions that extract nutrients from the soil or change practices around their farm practices. And they receive those payments for, a nutrient neutrality contract is 80 years, so an awful long time. But the payments can come in over different periods, and then you've sort of got the biodiversity that you could potentially stack onto that as well. So that's the sort of medium term. The long-term side of things, I mean, it's really hard to know, isn't it? I don't even know what the time horizon is on that. That's probably 30 years out. If we don't see the creation of some form of community wealth fund in Wales around nature finance, then I have not done my job or worked in this field in the right way. I would deeply hope that whatever upside there is from this marketization process, that is captured in some kind of pre-distribution of wealth. And what I mean by that is what you see Community Energy Wales doing is absolutely groundbreaking. We have large scale energy projects coming to Wales. What they are looking to do is work on community equity. So there's ownership of that project. And that ownership is in a form of equity. So what that means is that you own part of the development. So as that development earns money as a business, it's selling energy, right? It's cash flow there. The community gets the benefit for that. So if you can raise kind of shares to have the community to buy some of that equity, or if they receive a loan in blended finance, say for the Development Bank of Wales, then there's a kind of opportunity there to really think through how do you also support the local economy in Wales, and I think then the long term for me that is what we're aiming for. Whether that can work, I don't know. But yeah, that's hopefully some reflection on where I see things at the minute. Ask me in a year, I might have a different answer. But that reflects a few of our priorities, at least. And we are taking things in stages. So absolutely nothing we do will be launched tomorrow. Everything will be taken in stages with the right level of policy and kind of integrity around things, with kind of, we hope to, as I've said earlier, unfold that kind of co-production work, right, with farmers and landowners. Ultimately, we don't just kind of design things in the office here and pull them out. We have to move in that way as well. So yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Kath. That was a really good exploration of the different schemes or mechanisms, however we want to describe them, and their different embryonic or not stage that they're in Wales in particular. That's really helpful. I know Martin's popped not a question, but perhaps a comment with a bit of a question at the end there, which kind of reflects the not new money, but moving existing money in different ways. So when we go around the room, I'm about to come to Alice with a question next. Alice, if you want to reflect some response to Martin as well in what you've said, but mine is slightly different. It was a bit more on the nuts and bolts. Given how you described the journey that Summit C had been on, and how you've embedded co-production principles within the way you move forward, I think that's a really interesting granular process for how these systems can become more mainstream. Would you just be able to describe in a little bit more detail how your co-production process actually works when a new opportunity lands for you to explore?
Okay, so in terms of decision making, at the moment it's quite simple. And it's something that we're going and we're sort of re-looking at the moment, because there was such a large number of people who were consulted and worked on the co-production, that we have to kind of break that down when you're looking at decision making, because obviously it's not actually practical to ask everybody every decision, you know. There has to be a we have to set up different processes for different things and look at what's the most important kind of whether it's a level of funding that we go for. You know, we've talked about it being over you know, £100,000 or something, but then it's sort of, well, actually, even if it's below that, you still want to know, you know, you still want your partners to know. So then there's sort of setting up there have been subcommittees and liaison groups that then deal with different themes. Since I've been in post, we haven't been delivering those as much, partly because I think a little bit, as Chris was talking about, you get locked into, when you're delivering a project for a funder, you then get locked into these kind of outcomes that you have to deliver. So I'm trying to work out, as I think we all are, how can you manage being in that funding cycle where you have to have outputs that you need to deliver, whilst at the same time trying to also stop and reflect and take those pauses and have time to work on the strategy and build in that time for the co-production, because it is really time consuming and it's really challenging. And I think that, I suppose, its own, and this is the first iteration of project delivery that Tir Cannol has done. So for me, there's a lot of kind of, hang on a minute, can we just pause there, and maybe there's a different way that we could do that. So it's all about, I suppose, the fundamental is that co-production is about learning and it's growing together, but it's allowing ourselves that space to do that. And if we make a mistake, it's owning the mistake, and it's kind of being there with the community and in being very honest about what that looks like, or saying, oh, well, we had this idea, but actually it could be done better. I'm slightly waffling now, but
no. I completely understand what you're saying. And it's interesting how it ties back to what Kath was saying about taking the time. And I think for all of us working in this space, it's taking the time that actually can result in a real challenge, because we know we have to move quickly, and yet at the same time we need to move slow enough to bring community with us, but also to make sure things are done properly, because we know the existing systems have resulted in a lot of inequity, and moving forward will require that degree of consensus, but it does take a lot more pain and thought.
I mean, I would one just kind of, and I've talked to them about this, so I'm not saying anything they don't know. The Welsh Government are some of the worst for this, because they will put out pots of money that you have to submit an application for within 3 weeks, and say, well, this is a fantastic opportunity, and there's another, you know, we want you to collaborate on it. Well, if you want us to collaborate on it, then we need a lot more time to prepare the application. Oh, but we want you to deliver it within 5 months by the end of the financial year, and we want these outputs as part of it. So it's all of that kind of thing, and I do think that of all of the funders I've worked with, Welsh Government are actually some of the most inflexible and highest expectation in terms of what, you know, that output, and talking about, and there's some amazing individuals who are like, we want to do it this way, how do we do it this way? You know, like, well, we need to stop being tied to that funding cycle, but they're tied within it's a political cycle as well. The system is a political cycle as well, which is one that they are tied to. So that's within another system within the system, isn't it?
It is that interesting tension, isn't it? Because obviously when we talked about those principles that that Summit to Sea has in terms with who they'll engage, the safest money is public money, but public money has a time scale associated with it and challenges associated, and that value for money piece that Chris mentioned about return on investment for the public purse. So there's that real tension between quick and easy money, which may come from sources that are potentially challenging, but also not necessarily delivering everything we want to, and long-term investment in a space and investment in an outcome. And Chris, given the length of time that the Living Levels project has been running, because it is quite an emblematic project for South Wales, if you could blue sky think of an ideal funding mechanism to support you with work going forward based on the conversations we've been having today, how would you see that working?
Well, I said to one of my colleagues this morning, if I win the lottery this weekend, then I'll just fund the whole thing myself, and you know, that'll be the end of that. So, yeah, the whole funding model for projects like this is just fundamentally flawed. You know, it's a competitive process, so when we put the projects together, we have to over-egg the pudding to make sure that we get the funding in the first place, which then leaves us overcommitted in terms of the outcomes and outputs that we need to produce to keep the funder happy, which gives us very little time to actually sort of develop the sort of longer term thinking within those, because you know, the time is just so restrained within it, and it's a very frustrating process to be in at times. Having said that, this is my first time working on the development phase of a project, and I've made this criticism of every lottery project that I worked on, that you know, there are too many outputs, too many projects involved, and of course I've done exactly the same thing. Every day something new will come along, and I think I'd love to include that in the bid, and so yeah, I'm guilty as well. But it is a problem, and Alice, you know, picked up, you know, this problem with government funding is you get these really short turnaround times. You know, they'll announce it a week before Christmas that we've got this big pot of money for you to spend. Come to us with your great ideas, and it all has to be spent before the end of the financial year. I mean, it's infuriating, absolutely infuriating. It doesn't lead to you know, well-designed projects. It doesn't lead to lasting outcomes, which is, of course, what we want. That's what it has to be about. You can get great short-term outcomes, but I mean, my experience of working on these short-term projects is that often you can, you know, with regard to sort of communities, is you can end up with a negative feeling at the end, because you raise people's expectations, you get them all excited, the money runs out, and people are left wondering what the hell was that all about, you know?
Yeah.
And we're on to the next thing now, you know, or particularly our organizations are on to the next thing. And that's what I say about this being their sort of almost like an institutional conditioning. You know, they think in terms of these 3-year funded projects. And I just do not think that's the way to go. And demonstrably, it's not given us the nature recovery that we desperately need.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely hearing some key themes coming out of this conversation. One of them is time to do it well and do it right, but we don't necessarily have the time, either from the current funding mechanisms or from the environment within which we live. A need to build consensus and bring community with us, of whomever that community is. And that can be the people with whom we're working, whether they be the owners of the land or the people living in that community who don't own land, but also the community, the financial community, to bring them with us. And that government has a role to play there in incentivizing their involvement in the process. And then pivoting our thinking from about short-term ad hoc investment based on political cycles or availability and underspend to long-term sustained investment in our environment that is equitable for everything in it, not just everyone. And that's been a really interesting message coming out of this. I see, Kath, you've got your hand raised. We're starting to slip over into the time, but I'm happy to give you some time to come in for some last thoughts.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought we were
No,
finishing at
please do.
1:30. And Liz, you know me, I could still talk all night about this stuff. But we're describing as well in this a political economy problem. Announced today was the Scottish government's, potential future where they can issue their own finance, right? We need government in the room to drive this agenda. This is not about a continuing hollowing out of our public sector. This is a strengthening of the public sector to drive towards these outcomes. And I think that is a political economy issue. I'd say when we're working in place, we have to be able to show that working with our communities, there are examples here. There are, this is how we could look, we have to kind of show that and then influence up again. And I think there's lots that we're trying to do in that space as well, and think about the wider system that we're in, vis-a-vis, the food system, right? Talk about funding for nature. We're trapped in a disastrous food system at the minute. So yeah, hopefully the more we do, the more we can also create common ground together in place to provide an advocacy platform for change at our national and UK level government, because that is unfortunately, not moving at the pace that I know some of us would like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you, Jasmine, for putting your comments in the chat. Just to finish off, because some of us have buses to catch, as has been flagged, I think it's really important that we do build on that excellent legislation that we do have in Wales, that Kath mentioned at the outset, but it has to be made real, and we can take a positive lens on it and say the slightly slower pace the Welsh Government is moving allows us to build on learnings from across the border, and goodness knows, maybe even across the Channel and elsewhere around the world. So we know this is a very active space. We can take advantage of other people's learnings, both in the positive and the negative, and we definitely should. I will hand back over to Jane. Thank you very much for the opportunity to chair this session, Jane. It was really exciting and interesting.
Thank you. Well, just a very quick finishing off for me. This has been so interesting. And what's coming up for me, I went to a conference yesterday, the Wellbeing Economy Wales had a conference in Swansea, and they had a speaker from Hywel Dda, who was saying that one of the things that's most in shorter supply moment, not so much money, is trust, and how important it is to build trust, because a dollop of money coming from on high can just shatter along the fault lines, can't it? Like we saw with, I think that's what partly what happened to Summit to Sea. So I'm very inspired to share this knowledge, which I think this meeting has been a great start for that, so that it's to demystify it a bit, to raise, to surface all the questions. I mean, Chris did that very strongly, I think, talking about the, people who've been living in the land for generations, and then we come along with a fancy idea. So we must stay true to our local populations and our local places. So the biosphere is really keen to do that. I think that's our role, really, is to build that trust by sharing knowledge and bringing people together. So this has been wonderful. A quick plug for the Wales Real Food and Farming Conference next week, where Kath is speaking in a session on nature governance, which will no doubt touch on these themes a bit. And the whole conference is also about bringing people together into a shared understanding of food and farming in Wales, so that we do build that trust. It happens at all levels, national and local. So thank you very much, everyone. There'll be a recording on its way, a blog post, I don't know, we'll summarize it all. So thank you very much. It's been really, really interesting hour and a half, really worthwhile. Thank you all.